For 19 years, Duke had been nothing but loyal. He had stood guard at the door, protected his family, and greeted them every day with unwavering devotion. He had chased away intruders, comforted them on dark nights, and given them his entire world. But when his legs grew weak, when his once powerful body began to tremble, they abandoned him, like an old piece of furniture they no longer needed. Now he lay curled in the cold metal cage of a shelter, the walls echoing with the barks of younger, healthier dogs. They still had hope. Duke did not. His once majestic golden fur had faded to grey and had become patchy from months of neglect. His ribs were slightly visible beneath his frail frame, his once bright brown eyes now clouded and tired. He no longer stood to greet people as they passed by. He had learned the truth. No one wanted an old dog. For 6 months, people walked past his cage, their eyes lighting up at the sight of energetic puppies wagging their tails. But when they reached Duke, they barely spared him a glance before moving on. A dog that old? Too much work, not worth the heartache. Poor guy, whispered Emma, a young shelter volunteer, as she refilled Duke's untouched water bowl. He barely drinks anymore, she added, her voice filled with concern. Greg, the shelter owner, leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Duke with a sorrowful gaze. We've tried everything, he admitted with a sigh. He stopped eating the moment he realized his family wasn't coming back. We don't know if he's waiting for a home or if he's just waiting to give up. Duke's ears flicked slightly at their voices, but he didn't lift his head. He had stopped caring. Until she walked in. Sarah Bennett hadn't stepped foot in the shelter in over a year. Not since Jake. She and her late husband had spent weekends here, walking abandoned dogs, giving love to the ones who had been forgotten. But then Jake got sick, and in what felt like the blink of an eye, he was gone. Since then, Sarah had shut herself away, closing doors, both physically and emotionally. But today, for some reason, something pulled her back. Maybe it was the unbearable silence in her house. Maybe it was the loneliness that had settled deep in her bones. Or maybe it was fate. She walked past rows of young, eager dogs, their tails wagging, their barks echoing with excitement. And then, in the farthest corner, she saw him. A dog unlike any other she had ever seen. He didn't move, didn't bark, didn't even look up. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her breath catching. Something about him felt eerily familiar. It was the stillness, the resignation, the quiet acceptance of loss. She knew that feeling. She lived that feeling. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg and Emma exchanged glances. "That's Duke," Greg said softly. "He's been here for 6 months." Sarah took a small step closer, kneeling beside the cage. "How did he end up here?" Greg exhaled, his voice heavy. His family brought him in, said he was too old, that they didn't have time for him anymore. Sarah's breath hitched. 19 years. Greg nodded. 19 years. He was theirs, and they just left him. Sarah felt something break inside her. She couldn't understand it. How could someone abandon a dog who had been by their side for nearly 2 decades? Her fingers gripped the cold metal bars. "Does he ever respond to anyone?" Emma shook her head sadly. "Not really. He barely eats, doesn't react to people. It's like he's already given up." Sarah's heart clenched. She looked at Duke's frail body, the slow rise and fall of his ribs, the way his ears twitched just slightly at the sound of their voices. It wasn't just his body that was tired, it was his soul. And Sarah knew exactly how that felt. Without another word, she unlatched the cage door and stepped inside. "Duke," she whispered. No response. She reached out, hesitating just above his fur. "Duke, look at me." And then, for the first time in months, he stirred. His cloudy brown eyes lifted just barely, meeting hers, and in that single, fleeting moment, everything changed. Duke's eyes met Sarah's for just a second, long enough for her to see it. Pain, confusion, loss. And then just as quickly his gaze drifted away, as if he was retreating back into the empty void he had been living in. Sarah's chest tightened. Most shelter dogs reacted when someone stepped into their cage. Some wagged their tails. Some barked excitedly, eager for attention. Others cowered in fear. But Duke, he did nothing. No flinch, no movement, no hope. He had given up. Sarah. Greg's voice was soft, cautious. Don't get your hopes up. She turned slightly, glancing at him over her shoulder. What do you mean? Greg sighed, running a hand over his beard. We've had old dogs before. Some come in scared, some aggressive, some depressed. But Duke, he hesitated. Duke's empty. We don't know if it's his age or if it's whatever happened to him before he got here. Sarah swallowed hard, looking back at the frail German shepherd. 19 years, that was a lifetime. Most dogs didn't live that long, and the ones that did, they didn't end up alone in a shelter, discarded like a worn-out pair of shoes. She took a slow breath, her fingers hesitantly reaching out toward him again. He wasn't always like this, she murmured. Emma, the young volunteer, tilted her head. What do you mean? Sarah's fingers hovered just inches from Duke's fur. I don't know much about German shepherds, she admitted, but I know dogs. And no dog survives to 19 without being loved first. No dog makes it this far without fighting for their life. Emma bit her lip, looking at Duke sadly. So, what happened to him? Greg exhaled sharply. We only know what his owners told us, and honestly, I don't trust a word of it. Sarah frowned. What did they say? Greg's jaw tightened. That he was just a family pet, that he was slowing down, that they didn't have time to care for an old dog anymore. His voice darkened. They made him sound like an inconvenience, not a best friend, not a dog who had given them his entire life. Sarah's stomach twisted. She turned back to Duke, her fingers grazing the cold metal bars of his cage. Did they say how long they had him? Greg hesitated, then nodded grimly. Since he was a puppy. Sarah's breath caught. 19 years, and they had him for 19 years, and they still walked away. A wave of emotion crashed over her. Anger, disbelief, sadness. But the worst part, understanding, because she had lost someone too. And that kind of loss, it changes you, it leaves you hollow, drifting through life like a shadow of the person you used to be. Or in Duke's case, a shadow of the dog he once was. Sarah inched her hand closer. Duke, she whispered again. The old shepherd stirred slightly, his ears twitching. But still, he didn't look at her. She could feel Greg and Emma watching, waiting for her to realize what they already knew. Don't take it personally, Greg said softly. He doesn't respond to anyone. Sarah swallowed. Did anyone even try adopting him? Emma looked away. Greg sighed. A couple of people asked about him, but the second they saw how old he was, how sick he looked, he shook his head. No one wants to bring home a dog just to watch him die. Silence fell over the room. Sarah's chest ached. She had come here with no intention of adopting a dog. She had barely been able to take care of herself for the past 2 years, let alone another life. But as she sat there looking at Duke, this frail, broken creature who had been cast aside by the people he had loved, she knew one thing for sure. He didn't deserve to die in this place, not like this. She took a deep breath. I'll take him. Emma's head snapped up. Wait, really? Greg frowned. Sarah, are you sure? I'll take him, she repeated, firmer this time. Greg hesitated, then glanced at Duke. He might not even make it through the night, he warned. He hasn't eaten properly in weeks. Sarah's heart clenched, but she lifted her chin. Then at least he won't spend his last night alone. A beat of silence. Then Greg nodded. "All right," he said, "I'll get the paperwork." Sarah turned back to Duke, reaching out once more. This time she let her fingers graze the fur on his back. It was coarse, brittle, and Duke flinched. Sarah's breath hitched, not in pain, not in surprise, but in fear. Her stomach dropped. What had this dog been through? The drive home was silent. Duke lay curled up in the back seat, motionless. His frail body barely shifted with the bumps in the road. He didn't whine, didn't glance up at the world passing by outside the window. He was just there, a presence, but barely. Sarah gripped the wheel, her heart pounding. What had she just done? Taking him had been an impulse, a decision driven by something she didn't fully understand. Instinct, maybe. Or something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. She exhaled, stealing a glance at him through the rearview mirror. Would she be enough for him? Could she even help a dog who had already given up? As she pulled into the driveway, the cold Montana night wrapped around her, the wind howling softly through the trees. Winter was coming. She stepped out, her boots crunching against the frozen gravel, and opened the back door. "Duke," she said gently. Nothing. Her chest tightened. Was he asleep or dash? A wave of panic crashed over her as she crouched down, pressing a hand against his side. Warm, still breathing. She let out a shaky exhale, relief making her dizzy. Carefully, she reached under him, her arms trembling slightly as she lifted his fragile body. He didn't resist, didn't react at all. It was like carrying a ghost, a whisper of the dog he once had been. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and carried him inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. The last time she had walked through this door with a life depending on her, it had been Jake. And she had lost him. But this was different. Duke wasn't Jake. Duke still had a chance. She set him down gently on a large dog bed near the fireplace, her heart pounding in her chest. He curled up, slow, stiff, heavy, and let out a deep breath. She knelt beside him, brushing her fingers over his brittle fur. "You're home, Duke," she whispered. "I promise." Nothing. He didn't lift his head, didn't acknowledge her. Sarah sighed and stood, running a hand over her face. She had expected that. Walking into the kitchen, she grabbed a bowl, filling it with warm, broth-soaked kibble. If he wouldn't eat solid food, maybe he'd take this. She placed the bowl in front of him. "Come on, buddy," she coaxed softly, "just a little." Duke blinked sluggishly, but he didn't even sniff it. Her chest tightened. What had they done to him? She grabbed a soft blanket and draped it over his frail body. This time, he didn't flinch. Progress, or maybe he was just too tired to care anymore. Sarah sat down on the couch, watching him. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2, and Duke barely moved. She leaned her head back, exhaustion creeping in. She hadn't felt this drained in a long time. Her eyelids grew heavy. The last thing she saw before sleep pulled her under was Duke, lying still, his eyes open, staring at something unseen. A sound woke her. Sarah's eyes snapped open. The house was dark. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and Duke was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Duke!" Silence. She pushed off the couch, her feet hitting the cold wooden floor. Her pulse roared in her ears as she searched the dimly lit room. Then she saw him. Duke stood in the hallway, rigid, a statue carved from shadows and moonlight. His cloudy eyes were locked on something, frozen in place. Sarah followed his gaze and froze. Duke was staring at a picture on the wall, a picture of Jake. Her stomach flipped. She took a slow, hesitant step forward. "Duke!" His ears twitched, but his eyes remained fixed on the photograph. And then, in the absolute silence of the house, he did something she never expected. Duke let out a low, broken whimper. Sarah's breath hitched. Duke hadn't made a sound since she had met him. Not a bark, not a growl, nothing. But now, looking at her late husband's face, something inside him stirred, something deep, something painful, something Sarah wasn't ready to understand. Sarah stood frozen in the dim hallway, her breath coming in uneven, shallow bursts. Duke's whimper had faded into silence, but the weight of it still hung in the air, fragile, broken, filled with something unspoken. Her gaze flickered between the old German shepherd and the photograph of Jake. Why was Duke reacting like this? For days, he had been nothing but a shadow, unresponsive, motionless, indifferent to the world around him. But now, he was staring at a man he had never met, and there was recognition in his cloudy eyes. Sarah's chest tightened. She took a slow, cautious step forward, keeping her voice gentle. "Duke, what is it?" His ears twitched, but he still didn't turn toward her. His body remained eerily still, as if locked in place by something beyond her understanding. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. This wasn't normal. She had never seen Duke react to anything, not food, not movement, not even her voice. But now he was transfixed. She reached out slowly, resting her palm on his back. No flinch this time. Progress. But he still didn't relax. His breath was uneven, his chest rising and falling in slow, strained movements. Sarah swallowed hard. "Come on, Duke," she whispered. "Let's get you back to bed." For a long moment he didn't move. Then, finally, with a sluggish blink, he broke his gaze away from Jake's picture. And just like that, the moment was gone. She led him back to his bed by the fireplace, her mind racing. Had Duke known someone like Jake before? Was it just a coincidence, or was there something she wasn't seeing? The next morning, Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and the quiet crackling of the dying embers in the fireplace. She sat up groggily, rubbing her temples. Then her breath caught. Duke was awake, not just awake, watching her. Her heart skipped a beat. For the first time since she had brought him home, his eyes weren't dull and empty. They weren't exactly full of life either, but they were there, present. "Morning, buddy," she said softly. Duke blinked. Sarah hesitated, then decided to test something. She stood up and walked toward the kitchen. She didn't call him, didn't make a sound. She just waited, and then soft footsteps, the quiet shuffle of paws on the hardwood floor. Her heart skipped. She turned, and there he was. Duke had followed her, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But after everything, it felt like the beginning of something. Sarah knelt, grabbing a bowl and filling it with food. Duke stood a few feet away, watching. She stirred warm broth over the kibble. "I know you don't trust me yet," she murmured, "but we're getting there, aren't we?" She set the bowl down. Duke stared at it. Sarah held her breath. Seconds passed, and then Duke lowered his head and took his first bite. Sarah exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and something dangerously close to hope swelling in her chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was trying. The days passed and Duke's walls began to crack just a little. He still slept most of the time. He still barely acknowledged her. But now, whenever she moved from one room to another, he followed. Not close enough to touch, but watching, observing, waiting for something. One evening, Sarah sat on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, flipping through old photos. Duke lay nearby, his head resting on his paws. She smiled sadly, tracing her fingers over an image of Jake holding a puppy. It had been taken years ago, back when they had first talked about adopting a dog, back before hospitals, before grief, before loss. Sarah sighed and set the picture down. She glanced at Duke. "I think you would have liked him," she whispered. Duke lifted his head. Sarah froze. Her pulse quickened. For days she had been talking to him and he had never responded. But now, something about her words. He had understood. Her chest tightened. She stared at him, realization sinking deep into her bones. "Who were you before they left you?" she murmured. She had to know, she had to find out, and something deep inside told her that when she did, it would change everything. Sarah could feel it. Duke was changing. It was slow, so gradual that most people wouldn't have noticed. But she noticed everything. He ate now, not much, but enough. He followed her around the house, not close, but always watching. And sometimes, in the deep silence of the night, she would hear him let out a quiet sigh, a sound so heavy that it felt like it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Sarah knew that feeling well. Loss did that to you, but what had Duke lost? And more importantly, who had he been before they abandoned him? She had to know. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She grabbed her car keys and headed out. This time, not to the shelter, but to the people who had abandoned him. She had Greg's records. She knew their names. She wasn't looking for a fight. She just wanted answers. The house was larger than she expected. A two-story home with a wraparound porch, a perfectly trimmed lawn, and a luxury car in the driveway. This wasn't a family who had struggled and been forced to give up their dog. They had simply chosen to. Sarah clenched her jaw and knocked on the door. After a moment it opened. A woman in her early 60s stood there, dressed in an immaculate cardigan and pearls. She had the kind of face that had never known real hardship. She blinked at Sarah, frowning. "Can I help you?" Sarah took a steady breath. "Hi, my name is Sarah Bennett. I adopted Duke." The woman's face remained blank. Sarah felt something inside her tighten. "Your dog, the one you left at the shelter." For a long moment the woman said nothing. Then, with a casual shrug, she shook her head. "Oh, him. Not Duke, not even our dog, just him." Sarah's hands curled into fists. She pushed past the rage building in her chest. "I was hoping you could tell me about his past," she said, keeping her voice level. "I want to understand where he came from." The woman pursed her lips. "We had him for a long time," she said dismissively, "but he was getting old, slowing down. It wasn't fair to keep him." Sarah's stomach twisted. "So you abandoned him?" The woman didn't even flinch. "We gave him a chance to be adopted by someone else." Sarah saw red. "He's 19, she snapped. "No one was going to adopt him. You knew that." The woman crossed her arms. "Why are you here?" Sarah exhaled sharply. "Because Duke isn't just any dog. There's something about him, something I don't understand, and I think it has to do with his past." The woman hesitated just for a second. Sarah caught it. "You know something, don't you?" For the first time, the woman looked uncomfortable. Then she sighed. "You should talk to my husband." He was already waiting for them in the living room. A tall man in his 60s, grey-haired, weathered, regret carved into the lines of his face. His eyes flickered with something Sarah couldn't read when she introduced herself. "So you have him now," he murmured. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "He wasn't supposed to be ours." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" The man exhaled, rubbing his temples. "We didn't get him as a pet. He was a working dog, a partner." Sarah's breath caught. "Partner?" The man met her gaze. "He was a K9, my K9. Sarah stared. The world tilted. "You were a cop?" she asked. He nodded. "Retired now. But Duke wasn't always. Back then he was Shadow, and he wasn't just a good dog. He was the best." Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. She had known Duke was different. She had felt it from the start. But a K9, that explained everything. The discipline, the watchfulness, the way he understood commands without words, and most of all, the way he had reacted to Jake's picture. Her throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell the shelter?" The man's face darkened. "Because it didn't matter. He was old. No one would want him once they saw that." Sarah's jaw clenched. "But he wasn't just a pet to you," she said, her voice shaking. "He was your partner. He would have died for you." The man looked away. "I know." Sarah took a sharp breath. "Then why did you abandon him?" his hands curled into fists. Because I couldn't watch him die. A heavy, awful silence filled the room. Sarah felt something inside her crack. He gave you everything, she whispered, and you walked away. The man's expression twisted, a mixture of shame and something else. He wasn't himself anymore, he said quietly. He started getting confused, started forgetting commands. His legs weren't strong. It hurt to see him like that. He wasn't the dog I knew anymore. Sarah's stomach churned. That's not a reason to throw him away, she whispered. The man flinched. Sarah had heard enough. She turned sharply, heading for the door. Wait, the man called after her. She stopped. Is he still fighting? He asked. Sarah exhaled shakily, and then, in a voice laced with unbreakable certainty, she answered, Yes, and then she walked out. But as she reached her car, something hit her. Something she hadn't even considered until now. Duke had been trained. That meant he had a past, a history, and, possibly, an unfinished mission. The drive home was a blur. Sarah's grip tightened around the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her heart pounding. Duke wasn't just a pet. He had been a protector, a warrior, and when he needed someone the most. They walked away. Sarah blinked away the sting in her eyes. Not again. She wouldn't let that be his ending. When she pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet. She stepped inside, closing the door softly. Duke lay on his bed near the fireplace, his eyes half open. His ears twitched at the sound of her footsteps. She knelt beside him. Hey, buddy, she murmured, running a hand gently down his back. For the first time since she had brought him home. Duke leaned into her touch. Sarah's breath caught. It was small, but it was everything. Her fingers trembled slightly as she continued stroking his fur. I know who you are now, she whispered. I know what they did to you. Duke blinked. Sarah exhaled shakily. You weren't just a good dog, she continued, her voice thick with emotion. You were the best, and they didn't deserve you. Duke's cloudy eyes met hers, and for the first time, his tail wagged, a slow, weak movement, but Sarah saw it and she knew. Duke still had fight left in him. Do you believe in second chances, in the power of love and redemption? If Duke's journey touched your heart, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this story with the world. Let's give hope to every soul still waiting for a chance.